Okay, so it's lovely to see you this afternoon, Henry, and I'd love to introduce to everyone else Henry Elliston of Efficient Portfolio, who's going to be having a chat about the sorts of things that people could be thinking about when they're planning their retirement. But maybe first, Henry, you'd like to tell us a little bit about how you got into financial planning.
Yes, of course. Hi, Jane. Nice to see you, and thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. Yeah, I mean, without giving you a long and detailed CV and history of my working life, I got into working originally with doctors and worked for the BMA, helping doctors with their pensions, sort of 15 or so years ago. I was working for a big company at that point. And what I found with that company was that whilst they delivered very sound and good advice, certainly for doctors, it was very much just about the product and the pension. It was about the investments that sat alongside it. And I always felt that there was a bit missing in that piece. And I then moved on to a big accountancy firm, and the accountancy firm was very similar in that there were great investment advice and all that sort of stuff, but there was never any great understanding of what sits around it. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I joined this company that I work for now, Efficient Portfolio. And the primary focus that we have at Efficient Portfolio is around the planning that happens with people as they get towards retirement and then subsequently after they've retired. And when I say planning, what I mean is understanding the money they've got, because obviously that's the nuts and the bolts that make up the plan, but actually a lot more of the softer things that sit alongside it. So how are people going to retire? What are they going to do when they retire? Where are they going to be spending their retirement? With who are they going to spend their retirement? And really in understanding those much softer issues, you find yourself in a position whereby really the choices that you get around the nuts and the bolts, the pension, the investments, and all that sort of stuff, falls into place in a much nicer way, and it really brings to life what you're trying to do with your money. Because no one's really everyone is just trying to save money, but it's nice to have an understanding as to why you're trying to save money, or indeed how much you need to save in order to be able to go away and do all those things. So that's what I do, and that's how we got into it. And it's worked brilliantly. And you know, in the 5 years that we've been doing it, not only has the director Charlie Redding written a number of books on this idea of lifestyle planning, but we've seen a number of clients, and actually, of course, over that time, hit retirement and then actually take into practice some of the tips that we've given them on the way, which has been so rewarding to see.
Lovely. And it ties in very nicely with what we're doing at Red Retirement Coaching as well, in terms of an all-round plan for your life. So we're going to ask you at the end for your number one tip, but what's the most common mistake you see people make with regard to planning their retirement?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, but in a sense, and despite what I've just said, I think it's people not understanding fully the numbers. So because actually, and why do people deal in pictures and they look out the window and all that sort of stuff, but actually you don't look at the world in a series of numbers. And so if you've got a pension fund that's worth £250,000 or £1 million or £100,000, do you know what that means? And I think that the mistake that people make is not understanding the benefit that that savings they've built up will actually provide for them. And in turn, what that leads on to is it means people work too long. And that's a real sad thing, you know. I mean, it's well reported that, you know, many people on their deathbed have never said that I wish I spent another 5 years working. And that's the wonderful thing, you know, if you can get that bit right, and you can give yourself another 5 years or 2 years or 6 months of being retired and being able to go away and do all those wonderful things that you want to be able to do, that's fantastic and that's brilliant. But the mistake is not knowing the numbers and therefore carrying on working for another 5 years when you didn't really need to.
So those numbers will underpin everything people are doing by way of planning their lives, I guess.
Yeah, that's it. And it's with the numbers that you build the plan. And that's really cool. And we saw this morning I was talking to a chap, wealthy doctor, but actually even he, despite the fact that the numbers that we're talking about were quite large, didn't really understand what it meant. You know, an intelligent man who deals with numbers all day long. But for him, without having that plan in place that shows, do you know what, you could retire tomorrow. And for him, we said, look, you could retire tomorrow and you will have enough money to last with your current lifestyle right the way through until you're 99. Sadly, we couldn't get him over the line of 100. But for him, it just brings a whole heap of clarity to what we're trying to achieve in helping people to retire long, happy, prosperous, but really enjoyable and fulfilled retirements.
Fantastic. And what would you suggest that people think about in those sorts of terms, their life planning, before they even get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do when we meet with all our new clients, actually, is we take them through a series of questions. And I think these are questions that anyone can sit down and think of. You don't need me to ask you them. But the first question we always ask is, if money was no object, how would you lead your life differently? It's the lottery question, essentially, right? Give yourself as much money as you want. Now go away and spend it. How would you spend it? And that, in the first case, is a really interesting question. And what it provides us with is a whole list of dreams and aspirations, invariably holidays, but sometimes fast cars or parties or whatever else. The next question is, we say, look, if you go to see your doctor and he tells you that you've got between 5 and 10 years left to live, think now about that. So you've got the money that you've got, but armed with that knowledge that at some point in the next 5 or 10 years, you're just going to drop off your perch. How would you change your lifestyle now? Would you bring that retirement age forward? Are there any other particular holidays that you really, really want to go and do and really, really want to go and see? I think that's another really interesting question to answer. And then the final question we answer is, you're going to see this doctor again, who's no longer a friend of yours, and he tells you that tomorrow's it, and it's all up. And now, thinking back on your life, are there any things that you really wish you'd done, that you really, really wish that you'd seen, or that you're annoyed that you never got to complete? And that again brings through a whole load more thoughts as to, you know, what is really, really important to me? What should I really have done? And we tend to find that people then answer that question in, well, I've really got to sort out my will, which I've been meaning to do for the last 25 years and still haven't got around to it. But also, we more often than not find, I want to spend more time with my family and I regret not having been able to do that. And that's so important too, because of course, now we know that that's the case. Well, we can now start to plan in the future. How are you going to spend more time with your family and all that sort of stuff? So those 3 questions, I would say, if anything, have a think about that. And then we can start to build a plan around it.
And in your experience, have people usually thinking along those lines already, or are those completely new to people when you ask them?
They're completely alien concepts. Completely alien. It's wonderful to do it because all of a sudden you sit in a meeting with a client who's come to talk to you about their pension, and then all of a sudden I go, right, well, thanks very much. I can see you've got £100,000 with Aviva and £200,000 with Scottish Widows. That's lovely. Right, now let's talk about, you've got as much money as you want in the world. What are you going to do with it? And they're like, oh, hang on, that's not what I've come here for. I've come for you to tell me to invest in this fund. They've never had those thoughts, and it's so important. And indeed, then when we go back and review and talk to them every year, we go back and we say, hey, look, when I met you last year or 18 months ago, whatever it was, this is what we were talking about. You said you wanted to go and walk on the Great Wall of China. You said you wanted to retire a little bit earlier. You said you wanted to go and spend more time with your grandchildren. Have you achieved any of that? And if they haven't, then we start asking the question, why? but it really it brings a lot more focus into what we're trying to achieve in retirement, as opposed to, well done, you've got a Scottish Widows pension. I think you could have found a slightly better fund than the one you've been invested in.
And I guess that gives a purpose to that saving, doesn't it? It's not just to sit and gloat about your money at the end. It's to go and do something with it that you really love doing.
Oh, you're quite right. Quite right. I mean, it's wonderful, of course, if you've got huge amounts of savings, and you've got financial security for the rest of your life, whatever you choose to do, whenever you choose to do it. Of course, it is. But I don't know. I've never met anyone in a meeting when I sat down and said, "Hi, I see you're saving to a pension. What's the point of saving towards this pension?" Because I am determined to save £1 million or an X number or whatever the case may be. They're saying I'm saving so I can retire. But of course, it's the next question that comes along. Why do you want to retire? What are you going to do once you've retired? It's all those questions that come after it that actually then they loop around to tell you, well, you might be saving towards £1 million, but you don't need it. You only need £500,000 or whatever the case may be. And that's, I think that's the most powerful point, the most powerful part to lifestyle planning, as opposed to just giving financial advice. Should you have fund A or fund B? Or maybe if you put fund C in it, you might get a little bit more money. But then again, if you retired a little bit early, you might not need the money. So who knows?
No. And when you've asked people those questions, what's been some of the memorable life plans people have come up with?
I've had some great ones. And I mean, some of the more often than not, I find there are some great holidays that people want to go to. And I'm not going to lie, the common ones are South America, Australia, and Southeast Asia. So we've had all those. A client recently told me that he was planning to do a trek around Antarctica. Rather him than me. So that was one. I often quite, and this doesn't surprise me so much, we often hear of people wanting to relocate. So, you know, very often people live in London, they've had enough of, I mean, especially now with what's happened over the last 18 months, but they don't want to live in London anymore. They want to move away to the coast. And many people move down to the south coast so they can go sailing or whatever else. But I think the most memorable, or certainly the most unusual one that my clients has told me about, was that they intend to go and ring, they're a bell ringer, campanologist, I think you call them, isn't it? And their intention is to go and ring the bells in all the cathedrals in the land, which is that's a great aspiration. I mean, it's not something you're going to do every day of the week, but certainly, I mean, it gives them an awful lot of weekends of activity. And obviously it's just a great thing, and he gets out and he meets lots of new people at the different cathedrals, and I presume he has to practice so he knows which bells to ring and when and all that sort of stuff. So it's a great thing. It's really unusual, and I appreciate it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea either.
But it might spark off some ideas.
That's it.
Okay, and I build this at the beginning of our chat, but what would be your number one tip for anyone planning their income in retirement?
Well, I think my number one tip, and it's not going to surprise you, would be, well, actually, I can take two. I'm sorry, Jane, but my first one would be those questions that I mentioned a little bit earlier. How much money? Imagine you've got all the money. What are you going to do with it? What happens if you die within 5 or 10 years, or indeed tomorrow? Start thinking about that. And the next thing I would say is then go and sit down with someone and talk it through and build a plan, because it's having a plan that will just give you like a great overall picture as to what life is going to be like, or indeed what you could make life like. I mean, it's never too early to plan for retirement, of course, but in putting that plan in place, it's just going to create so much clarity and just give you so much more freedom when you do retire, or indeed in retirement, knowing that life is always going to be financially all right, and you don't necessarily need to scrimp and save. And that holiday on the Orient Express quite possibly is completely affordable, even though you always thought it wasn't.
That's great. Thank you. So Get clarity. It's a good goal.
Get clarity. That's right. Get a plan drawn up and get clarity as to what you can do and when you can do it.
That's great. Henry, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.